Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Authors on the Air. I'm Dan White, creator and host of Out with Dan, a podcast that sits on the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network platform. Today, we have a special guest interviewer, best-selling and award-winning author Reed Farrel Coleman. Welcome, Reed.
Hey, Dan, how you doing?
Wonderful. I'm going to exit out now and let the two of you get to chatting, and I'll see you in a little while.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm sitting in for Dan and for Pam Stack and all those other great guest hosts. I'm here today with my friend and radio legend, Richard Neer. But we're here only to talk about his legendary radio career a little bit, but we're here mostly to talk about his books. So, Richard, why don't you say hi to everybody?
Hi, everybody.
Very well done.
Just doing what you asked me to do.
Yeah. You'll have to forgive the echoiness of Richard's voice. You know, he has those radio pipes and he's in his mansion. So, you know, he's in the grand hallway of his mansion. So
that's not it at all. I grew up on Top 40 radio where there was echo introduced on purpose. So you sounded like God.
Yeah. So let me tell the audience the story is about 12 years ago, I began writing the Jesse Stone novels for the estate of Robert B. Parker. And one day, my publicist at Putnam says, "You'll be getting a call in your hotel room in St. Louis from this guy, Richard." And I said, sure, because when you're doing publicity on a book tour, they just give you a name, they tell you you'll be called, and I get this call. And all through the interview, I'm saying, I recognize this man's voice. I'm not quite sure where I recognize it from, but I recognize that voice. And that voice on the other end, and that Richard was Richard Neer. So Richard, is it true that in your adult life, you've basically had only two jobs?
Well, that's not quite true, but I'll go along. You know, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend, right?
Print the legend.
But, I have had two main radio jobs. One of them was WNEW-FM. I had a short interim period at WNEW-AM where I did a show called The Sports Connection. And since 1988, I've been with WFAN, which was the first full-time all-sports radio station.
Okay, so everybody in New York knows who you are, but for those people who are watching not in New York, why don't you tell us a little bit about WNEW? Because I know I grew up listening to it. So,
well, so did I.
Yeah.
I was in high school, college, a listener of WNEW-FM, and Allison Steele, the Nightbird, and Scott Muni and Jonathan Schwartz, all these wonderful personalities that I thought, boy, if I could ever just meet them, it would be wonderful, much less imagine working with them. So I was working in college at a small FM radio station that played beautiful music in FM stereo and classical music and all of that. But I aspired to play rock or pop music on the radio. And when I graduated from Adelphi University in Garden City, Long Island, my friend Michael Harrison and I convinced the owner of that little station to play rock music instead of the classical and dinner music that it was playing, primarily because he was losing his shirt with this and it couldn't have been any worse. So we did all kinds of fake research and we convinced him that the only way to fly would be to play rock music. So he reluctantly gave in, and within 6 months, we were the number one station on Long Island because there was a gap there. There was a créneau, as the French say. I know you know your French. There was no suburban rock station. There was only the urban stations, and they didn't speak to Long Island necessarily. So after 9 months of doing that, an opening came up at WNEW-FM, which was the premier progressive rock station in the country, with all those legendary people that I just mentioned. So Michael and I went into this station one Monday morning in March, froze our butts off, sat in the hallway outside the studio, waiting for Scott Muni, who was then the program director, to appear. And he shows up and he says, all right, come in the office. I'll talk to you. So we did like a 3-hour interview with Scott Muni. And most of the time it was Scott Muni telling us stories about himself, not asking questions about us. So, okay, we did that interview. We went home and didn't hear from him for a week. So we called back. All right, come back in. Came back in. Another 3 hours, mostly about Scott. And we brought in tapes, audition tapes, which you did back in the day of what you sounded like on the radio. And then a couple of weeks later, no reply. We called again. He said, well, I'd like you to come in and meet the general manager. So this is the final step of approval. So we came in. We noticed that the tapes were on Scott's desk, or the credentials behind his desk, untouched. He never listened to them. So we were like, what's he doing here? Brings in the general manager, and he says, I understand you two come as a package. And we said, well, we like working together, but, do you like one of us, not the other? We're not going to stand in each other's way. He said, no, I have 2 jobs. And he offered me a music director position and an overnight shift and Michael the morning show, which at that time was the lowest rated show on the station. Nobody listened to FM radio in the morning. They listened to AM radio. So I started as music director. Michael started doing the morning show. And within a month, one of the jocks, John Zackerly, Zach here, left the station, went to a competitor, and there was an overnight opening full-time for me, so I took it. Worked there doing overnights for about 7 years. Then I became the program director. Then I did the morning show. And by that time, mornings on FM were important. They were money makers. They were the prime time you wanted to be on FM radio. So I did that until 1986 when they called me into the office after being there for 15 years and said, you've just done your last show.
Wow. It's always fun getting fired, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Before
at least they did it in person and not by email or text like they do it today.
Well, or by smoke signal.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I can't leave leave the NEW history in the past yet, because you used to have a very famous friend who used to call you up very late at night. And this is about the most famous person either one of us knows. So just briefly, why don't you tell us about your late night caller when you used to do late night shifts?
Yeah, he called himself the Phantom Caller. Well, he would call. I would go to hockey games with the Columbia promotion man, my friend Maida Matthews. And we'd go to venues like Max's Kansas City and the Bottom Line, places like that after the game to meet his artists. And I met this scruffy guy from New Jersey playing too loud for the room, didn't make an impression on me at all. And I'd go backstage afterwards and say hello, and he's all sweaty, and I was going, I'm going to get out of here. So it turned out he started calling me when I was doing overnights, and we had long conversations. And, he talked about girls and music and sports and whatever, just very intimate, personal conversations. And I gave him the hotline, which is the number you get directly into the studio. And he'd always call on the listener line. He never wrote it down. It was Bruce Springsteen. And it was funny when he played The Bottom Line in 1975, these very famous concerts after Born to Run was released. This is when he really made it. And yet he kept calling me and we kept talking. And sometimes I get off the air at 6 o'clock and hang in the studio for another hour talking to him. So we became kind of buddies on the phone, very rarely seeing each other in person, sort of like you and me.
Yeah.
And, the rest is history. And, after Bruce made it really, really big, he's got Barack Obama and Tom Hanks as friends. So I'm not in very much contact, if at all, with him, but have been friendly with Steve Van Zandt, who wrote the prologue to my first published book.
Yeah, and that's where, before we move on to WFAN, I wanted to say, start to talk about your books a little bit. We always get asked at book signings, where do you get your ideas from? And I want to ask you, not where you get your ideas from, But where did you get the idea to become a writer from? Like, what behooved you to become a writer?
Well, I always enjoyed telling stories. When my parents moved from Syracuse, New York to Lynchburg, Virginia, when I was in my teens, they had a big station wagon and they'd make the drive up there back and forth a couple of times a year. And I'd be in the back of the car, those cavernous old station wagons, and I'd be telling stories to my brothers to amuse them. And I started, basically recapping movies that I had seen. And then I decided to make up stories of my own. So I always enjoyed telling stories. And back in the day, WNEW-FM, there were no restrictions. You could talk as long as you wanted. You could say whatever you wanted. You could tell stories. You could make jokes. You could do whatever, do interviews. I did the first American interview with Monty Python, all the guys in Monty Python. So after I lost the morning show in 1986, I did a sports talk show on WNEW-AM for a short period of time before going to FAN. And I always wanted to write. I always wanted to, I can speak extemporaneously, as you can hear, but I always wanted to put those thoughts into words on paper. So once computers came in and I didn't have to scrawl it longhand or type it because I'm a terrible typist, I started, write a couple of books and see what happens. So I wrote a novel, which wasn't very good and got immediately in my own slush pile. But I had sent, when WNEW-FM went off the air in 1999, I learned of an agent who was a listener to the station and was interested in the story of what happened, why such a big major radio station went down. So I sent him a piece that I thought maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get this in the New York Times as an obit for the station. And he looked at it and he said, "There's a book here." And I said, "Well, I'd like to try to write the book." And he said, "Go ahead." So I submitted a couple of chapters, and sure enough, I got in advance to write the nonfiction story, FM, The Rise and Fall of Rock Radio. Basically, my exploits at NEW and LIR, which was the station I started at. And then I broadened the deal to hit stations across the country, stations in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston. So I made it a story of the whole story of FM and the media and what happened to it and why that wonderful progressive period all of a sudden was tight playlist, just like the AM radio we were trying to get away from. So that book got published. Unfortunately, it got published the week of 9/11.
I was going to ask you to talk about the release date.
So yeah, all the publicity, the tour, everything got scotched because who wanted to hear about rock radio when the Twin Towers had been destroyed and we were all looking over our shoulders for terrorists everywhere. So the book did okay, but not as well as I thought it could have. But it encouraged me to write, and I started working on novels and eventually wound up publishing them myself as a way to do it the way I wanted to put the books out rather than have an editor change things and give me suggestions, of course, which is something I would dearly love to have right now.
Yes. So let me ask you, the series that you're known for is the Riley King series. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Riley?
Well, he was sort of inspired by Robert B. Parker, who, of course,
who was that? Robert B. Who?
Parker, yes. You want a little air, Parker? He was the guy that Reed picked up the mantle after Bob died and wrote the Jesse Stone books. I was more into the Spencer books, the Spencer for Hire books. And he had Hawk, who was a black friend of his. And I was going, well, I can't write as well as Robert Parker. I don't want to be a pale imitation. So I came up with a guy in Jersey who was a former FBI guy who became a private investigator named Riley King. Riley after my dog Riley, and King because when I was doing radio in the early days, Bob Papa, who does the Giants play-by-play, called me the King for some reason. I never found out why. So
don't worry, Richard. King. I'll never call you that.
No, I know you won't. Maybe a prince, but not the.
Yes.
So anyway, it started with Riley King, not even knowing that Riley King was actually B.B. King's real name. Learned that much later. And was a Jersey PI, and he was hanging out at the shore and, solving cases. And then I moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and I took Riley with me. I had Riley move there. And eventually I was in Hilton Head, South Carolina, where I am right now, and I brought Riley there. So for the last, I guess, 7 or 8 novels, Riley has been based in Hilton Head, solving small crimes in the Low Country.
So let's talk a little bit about self-publishing, because when I started out in publishing, which was in 1991, I mean, publishing not fiction, I was 1991. I had published poetry before then, which is the path to poverty, by the way, if anybody's interested. Become a poet.
That's how he became the hard-boiled poet. Yes.
Yes. Yes. And it was a hard-boiled poverty until I started publishing novels. When I started out in publishing, self-publishing was kind of a dirty, undercurrent. But it isn't now. It's probably the most vibrant part of beginning publishing is self-publishing. So why don't you tell me a little bit about why you chose self-publishing, about the books, the series, more than just about Riley, and how you produce your books.
Well, it wasn't by choice. I had submitted a couple of novels to the agent who got FM published, and he said, well, another private investigator, who wants that? And as you know, it's a tough field because there are so many established writers who have established characters who are private investigators. And most of it was, well, who needs another one unless he's something totally unusual? And my guy is not, he's not that unusual. He's a normal guy. So I said, well, all right. So I wanted people to read the books. I thought they were good. I thought they were as good as a lot of published authors and better than most, you accepted, of course. And I said, well, how do I do this? And I looked into it, and Amazon was offering a way to publish your own books. Now, it's a laborious process. I mean, you have to format it. You have to design a cover. You basically have to become your own publishing house. The good part of it is that they only get a very small cut of the royalties that you get for selling the book. So you're getting most of the money to the fruits of your labor yourself. The bad side is you got to become conversant with marketing, publicity, all kinds of ways to promote the book yourself. Now, luckily, I have a radio show, so I can talk about it there. But it's very difficult. Do you buy ads? Do you do interviews? What do you do to get the book sold? Writing it is fun. I mean, I write a chapter a day most days. I edit it myself. I have a couple of people look at it before I put it out. I have a line editor for typos and things like that. But it's a long, laborious process. It only takes me maybe a couple of months to actually write the book, and then more time to get the book ready for publication. So it's a lot of work.
Yeah. So what's the most recent Riley book?
It's called The One True Crime, and it's about a faded movie star who Riley grew up enjoying, who's going to make a low-budget movie. And Riley is asked to be a consultant, a technical consultant, to make sure that all the, things look right about it, because he is a detective. And as it turns out, Riley begins to suspect that maybe there's something else going on here. Why would this guy do this low budget thing? It doesn't make sense. And he thinks that it's a cover for some nefarious activity. And I'll leave it at that.
Kind of like this interview. So
what nefarious activity are we talking about here, Reed?
Well, I believe we're at the end of this. I could have gone on listening to you, for at least 3 more minutes. No,
I'm out of material, so that's not possible.
No, there's plenty between us. We have plenty of material. I just wanted to say, who do you read? Like, readers are really interested in who authors read. So why don't you give us 5 names of the authors you read.
If I can. The weird thing is I'll read books and I'll enjoy them, and then I'll forget who wrote them. Like I'll read a newspaper column and I'll forget who wrote it. I read the Don Winslow trilogy recently, which is really good. Right now I'm reading the book by Eric Larson about the lead up to the Civil War, which I think you would really enjoy. I did the audiobook of Oppenheimer, the American Prometheus book, which was 26 hours of narration. I've also done some narration, which I really enjoy. And I still read, I read you, of course, and I've read Tom Straw, and I've read Matt Goldman. I'm reading less and writing more, if that makes any sense. And I've kind of gotten caught into streaming television series like Shogun and Ripley and things like that, which I really enjoy.
Well, I think, like I said, I think we could go on forever, and we do. Our phone calls, Roseanne, my wife, always asks me, "Did you speak to Richard today?" I said, "We only speak twice a week," and she said, "No, it's more like 3 or 4 times a week."
Yeah, that's true. She's right.
And the calls tend to when you look down and say, "Oh, I've been on the phone with Richard for an hour and a half." So, yeah, we could go on. But Richard, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you for the opportunity, Reed. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. What a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed this, and I will invite both of you back if you want a part 2.
Love to.
Absolutely.
Lovely. Richard, do you have social media or a website that you would like to share?
RichardNeer.com, and Neer is Neer.
Well, that's direct and straightforward. I like that.
Yeah, and I have a Facebook page as well. Just look up the name in Facebook and you'll find it.
Perfect. Reed, what about you?
My website is also pretty clear. It's richardneer.com. It's Reed Coleman, no F in the middle, reedcoleman.com. And I too am on Facebook. And you can see my beautiful mug there and just chat with me. So
and the Reed F. Coleman, most people, when they use that, are not looking at your middle name as Farrell. They're using it for something else. Reed.
Yes. It's not 4 letters.
No, it's actually 7.
That will definitely be in part 2, I'm sure. So thank both of you for being on Authors on the Air today. It was a wonderful interview, and I'm so excited to have it out soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.